Good morning. Pine's class and Maloney class. I'm here in the sanctuary. It's an unusual experience with the cameras and whatnot, rather than zooming from home. That's John Ryan and I conspired to do that. He was going to be up here anyway. It's Thursday, by the way, and it's cold, and I've just gotten off my bike, and I might have a little nose drip. Sorry about that. But our lesson today follows two good lessons on the history of the aftermath of the disaster of destruction of Israel, not Israel, but Jerusalem and the surrounding territory, and going into exile. It's after the exile of Ezra and Nehemiah. It's interesting now that the lesson on the plate for today, our menu, is Lamentations, which occurred before the exit from the exile, of course. It was the destruction of Zion, which is Jerusalem, and the surrounding area. And it was a disaster. And our biblical text is from Lamentations. It's not a pretty story. It is from an eyewitness of the account, and is an account of the siege, a year-long siege now. Get that. A year-long siege of Jerusalem, a walled city, and then the eventual fall. And it's a lament. Actually, our lesson comes from the fifth of 5 laments in Lamentations. A lament is like a dirge, only there's no funeral. It's a woe is me, alack, alas. A tragedy has occurred, and I am in trouble. That is a fair translation of the tenor, at least, of what lament is. Well, it is written, we think, by an eyewitness to the siege and to the fall, the destruction of Jerusalem. And we've just been through, and still going through, the last stages of lockup due to the virus. So we've been separated from our friends often, maybe see some of them. But anyway, it's we feel closed off from the rest of the world. And at least the folks at the Pine, I know, the Pines, couldn't eat communally, but they had their meals brought to them. Now think about people under siege. Think about what this eyewitness to the siege, who lived it out, what they went through. I at least found out that there is water available behind the walls in Jerusalem. And I doubt that that would handle the needs over a full year of everybody there. And I guess there'd be some guesses. I'm sure there'd be some squabbles over who gets the water when. To say nothing of food. If there's no ingress and egress, where did the food come from? Well, when we get to reading the Lamentations, we'll get some clues to the answer to those questions. And remarkably, there's no account of squabbling, of people not wanting to stand in line and grabbing for this, that, and the other. It is a remarkable account. But it is also an account which is pretty tense and pretty gruesome. Well, how in the world am I going to handle that? Given the tenseness that's in the air, it's kind of being lifted. Now that we're getting to the good part of the control, lots of people being vaccinated. Nevertheless, it was providential this past Tuesday. I found an article, read an article in the Wall Street Journal, and the title grabbed me. It said, the title is God is in the Punchline. Wow. That just seemed to be tailor-made for this lesson. You recall that the downfall of God's city, Jerusalem, was the beginning of the widening of the covenanters' view of who is God. You know, they entered the promised land after God had rolled back the seas and crossed into the wilderness, and then they ended up ready to go to Jericho. They entered Jericho, and it was God who made the walls come tumbling down. Joshua was just there telling the people what to do. In other words, at that time, God looked more like a warlord. And now, in the face of destruction, complete destruction of God's house, the temple was burned to the ground. They had a comeuppance. And given time in exile and elsewhere, they realized that God was bigger than a warlord. And here is God is in the Punchline, is an article that's sort of on the same subject. And it is also about joking. Punchlines come in jokes. And it's in the Wall Street Journal. I thought it'd be appropriate to offer a little dessert, given that Lamentations is on the main course on the menu. Well, let me give you a synopsis of the article. The question that's raised is, does God have a sense of humor? I like that question. In fact, I argued to myself that God has to have a sense of humor. Here we've got this divine being, creator of everything there is. We live in a three-dimensional world, and if you take in time, maybe a four-dimensional world. But God oversees all the dimensions, however many you can count. And God looks down on us humans and just must laugh at some of the things we take seriously and conspiracy theory situations. We're misled easily. We don't understand a lot of things that we think that we do, and yet God loves us. And how do we know that? Well, we Christians know that because of what Jesus did. His actions were that. It might be tough love, but that's how we know that God is a God of love and God is love. Well, so aside from asking the question, does God have a sense of humor? The answer is hard to come by, and that point is made in Article 2. And the reason is this, I think. Can you imagine Jesus being humorous and having that recorded as part of the reason he's here on earth? We would misinterpret that might be that none of this is serious. Jesus really doesn't have a stake in this. So, the 2 points of the article, I think, are one, that it's a question, does God have a sense of humor? And the answer is he must. And we hope that he does, but he must. Okay. And there's something a little deeper here in this article that I think you might find amusing. I did. We're talking about the Wall Street Journal. Now, like the New York Times or the Times of London, or whether it's the London Times, I don't know, or maybe even the Washington Post, these are august enterprises. And there are folks who read the Wall Street Journal, for example, who anything the Wall Street Journal endorses, I'm for it. That could be what the editors of the Wall Street Journal think about their readership. Certainly it's the conservative side of things. Just like, on the other hand, the New York Times has a following. Anything you read in the New York Times, if you're on the left side of the political spectrum, you believe it. Now that, of course, is not universally true. My interest in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal is I like to see the other side and see how the left, quote unquote, is being viewed. So I have a quite different view from what maybe the editors of the Wall Street Journal have in their readership. So keep that in mind. I'm doing a synopsis in my own words, and I bet you it would never be published by the Wall Street Journal in the words that I have just used. It would have found a more, how shall I say, dignified version than what I've said. But let's see what was printed. And lo and behold, the writer of this piece is from Charlotte, and he's an attorney. Anybody know Mike Kerrigan? This is the piece that I'm referring to. Okay, well, what did the great Wall Street Journal say about this? To make the points, hoping that God does have a sense of humor, and probably Jesus would never have exhibited that because it had been misinterpreted. Here we go, I'm quoting. C.K. Chesterton closed out orthodoxy, that's a work, his 1908 masterpiece of Christian apologetics with a radical thought. He proposed that the one thing too great for God to have shown us when he walked on earth was mirth. This suggests that the idea of blissfulness we can't imagine was important to Chesterton. The mere possibility that it's true that one thing our mortal minds can't begin to fathom about God's nature is his joylessness, joyfulness, offers me consolation beyond measure. Now, that's the writer. Well, there's a statement of we hope God has a sense of humor. Well, we're sure he does, or she does, of course. But there's yet the editors, I'm sure, put the headline in. They didn't ask for Mr. Kerrigan's opinion on this. Remember the title of it is God in the Punchline. Well, where's the punchline? Here we go. Chesterton loved paradoxes, so it shouldn't surprise us that the best and wisest jokes often came from children. I experienced such a moment the other day. My 10-year-old son Jack and I simultaneously noticed that my wife, Debbie, had conspicuously removed her engagement ring and placed it atop a paper towel on the kitchen counter. Surely she was going to put it back on, but there it sat, for a moment as foreboding to me as my dear John, as a Dear John letter. And not only to me. Picking up on the disquiet, Jack looked up and deadpanned, "Well, I guess she played us both for fools." End of quote. Okay, that's the punchline from a child. And it says, the editors interpret that God is in the punchline. God has some humor. Well, I took that on face value and then began to think about it. And this is where it deepens a little bit, and there's more humor in this than was apparent to me initially. What child is going to come up with that quote? "Well, I guess she played us both for fools." A child who's 10 years old. I see the hand of the Wall Street Journal taking the quote that Mike Kerrigan's son, Jack, that he gave the Wall Street Journal and making it more like an adult statement that just fits the background of the journal. I think, and this is just my opinion, but the joke is probably on the readers of the Wall Street Journal. Here's the image of readers, the people who read it and believe everything that's in it. They worship at the Wall Street Journal. The joke is on them. This is a pure, easy message to the readership that Jack really didn't say that in these words. And there is the Wall Street Journal in the punchline, making fun of the readership. So the relationship between the Wall Street Journal and the readership needs to widen a little bit to relax some. Now, I hope that's the message that the Wall Street Journal is giving. Some of you may know that Mike Kerrigan. You can find out where that quote is right about. Excuse me. Okay, so much for the joke and the remembering the widening of God, the image of God, the understanding of God is more than just a coach who's going to lead the team to victory, to the universal God. Well, let's see. Here we've got before us the lament, the fifth of 5 laments printed in our lesson book. Very interesting in that these are poems. I'd like for you to think of a question so that you are an active listener as I read these 22 lines. An active listener has a good question. A passive listener is just going to hope we're going to get over this and then think about something else. So I'm asking for you to hang on. Listen to this, but keep in mind the following question. Why did the editors and the lesson writer of our lesson book place make a time inversion? Lamentations, this account occurred historically prior to Ezra and Nehemiah. But in fact, the way they're presented in a lesson book is just reverse. So let's ask ourselves, what is behind that? There must be a reason. And so we become active listeners, I hope. Well, here we go. This is, think about an eyewitness to the siege and fall of Jerusalem and destruction of the surrounding territory in Judah by the Babylonians, Nebuchadnezzar at the head. And think about that person's reaction, what that person thinks is important about that period, and therefore wrote it down. So here we go. Remember, O Lord, what has befallen us. Look and see our disgrace. Our inheritance has been turned over to strangers, our homes to aliens. Babylonians maybe. We have become orphans, fatherless, and our mothers are like widows. We must pay for the water we drink. The wood we get must be bought. With a yoke on our necks, we are hard driven. We are weary. We are given no rest. Well, I can hear something of the siege going on here, water and wood, and I can hear something of the conditions after that. Part of the Covenanters went off to Babylonia into perhaps slavery. The rest of them at their widows and orphans, sort of no place to go, at the mercy of those who are willing to let us help them put us in servitude. We have made a pact, and we continue to read. We have made a pact with Egypt and Assyria to get enough bread. Okay, there's the first clue, I think, about how this eyewitness, how did we get food and bread during the siege? Well, there was a lot of politics going on in those days, and the big players were Assyria, Egypt, and Babylonia. And so you work one against the other, and there possibly were some arrangements during the siege for the Egyptians to help out and the Assyrians to help out. So maybe that's how they got their food. And now here we go. Our ancestors have sinned, they are no more. We bear their iniquities. Our ancestors, I think that's a reference to the northern kingdom which fell and dissolved into alien culture and then heard no more of it. And that was their sin. Now we might be in Babylonia. Here slaves rule over us. There is no one to deliver us from their hand. We get our bread at the peril of our lives because of the sword in the wilderness. Well, this again may be a reference to the siege. Our skin is black as an oven from the scorching heat of famine. Some of the Jerusalemites did not go to Babylonia, to the Fertile Crescent, and they were still in the desert. And if Jeremiah actually wrote this, he's one who stayed back. In fact, he ended up in Egypt, and we're talking desert land. And I think probably that is a reference to those who actually stayed behind. Women are raped in Zion, virgins in the town of Judah. Zion was toppled, and people in it were subject to all kinds of bad things, and those around it were also the same thing. Women were raped in Zion. That's Jerusalem, virgins in the towns of Judah, surrounded area. Princes are hung up by their hands. No respect is shown to the elders. Young men are compelled to grind, and boys stagger under loads of wood. The old men have left the city gate, the young men their music. And we're talking about corporate, not just one person lamenting his own fate or her own fate. We're talking about all of the covenanters here. I should have made that point earlier. And that's a remarkable thing. This eyewitness is talking about all of us, not just me. The joy of our hearts has ceased. Our dancing has been turned into mourning. The crown has fallen from our head. Woe to us, for we have sinned. Interesting reaction. It's our fault. It is our fault. God is bigger than a warlord. God hasn't lost the battle. God is meting out judgment. Because of this, our hearts are sick. Change is hard. Because of these things, our eyes have grown dim. Because of Mount Zion, which lies desolate, that is Jerusalem, jackals prowl over it. That's God's house, abandoned. But you, O Lord, now we've got a little glimmer of light. That God, we really understand you better now. But you, O Lord, reign forever. Your throne endures to all generations. But then again, the lament. Why have you forgotten us completely? Why have you forsaken us these many days? A whole year. Restore us to yourself, O Lord, that we, not me, we may be restored. Renew our days of old, unless you have utterly rejected us and are angry with us beyond measure. The possibility, he says, is open. Okay, this God is bigger, but maybe we've done the ultimate wrong and we're out of luck. That's not a good way to end. That's just not very hopeful. Well, all right, you were an active listener during this. Why do you suppose, what do you have in the way of a reason why the editors decided to put Lamentations after they've already seen after they've given us a picture of the restoration and the picking up of the pieces? Well, I wish I had you here to answer that. The one thing I can think of is that there is hope. That last sentence is not answered in the negative. Unless you have utterly rejected us and are angry with us beyond measure, the answer is no. So we're looking, I think our editors didn't want to leave us completely flat, looking for some positive thing to say. Okay, I've got just a few minutes. About this business of watershed event, we understand God, we being the covenant community, a little better. And we got that joke about the Wall Street Journal trying to reveal themselves to their royal readership to expand their notion of what the editors are like. I brought along one of my favorite books. It's hardly called a book. It's called Your God is Too Small by J.B. Phillips. It's just about this, it is about this topic that has fascinated me for a good while now. We don't know. We don't know everything there is to know about God. We just can't. And so I like his title, Your God is Too Small. That means mine, and yours, and yours, and yours. And even J.B. Phillips, the author, his notion is not large enough. It's not grand enough. Can't be. Okay, well, the book I'm not going to go on and on with this, just a word or two. It's divided in a couple of sections. The first section is examples of some misinterpretations of God. And he lists those as destructive. And then some incomplete notions of God, which he thinks are constructive. So that gives you a view of sort of his slant on the subject of who is God. The one in the destructive part, which I think is somewhat like the Covenanters had before this watershed event, it's the 12th one. Interesting enough. And it's a projected image. When you project your own image on God. And that can be destructive. The other one is a good question to, as an active learner, a good question that he himself is asking is, what is the purpose of life? You can't answer one individual. Well, so much for the book advertisement. Thank you if you stayed to the very end. I appreciate that. Until next time.